The recording has now started. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I'll now turn it over to today's presenters.
Good morning, everybody. Marnie, did you want to say good morning?
Yes, good morning.
Actually, it might be afternoon for some of you in a later time zone. We're really happy to be here today to share some information about evaluation. So thank you for joining. So we'll go to the next slide. I would really like to acknowledge our relative from the East, Maurice John, for his opening and his reminders to remember our ancestors. I think it's just really important to do that. And he set us off in a really good way. I really appreciate that. And what I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, is that many of you, everybody, this year, we sat in front of computers. We were part of Zoom. Many of us probably have Zoom fatigue, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And I would like to, first of all, acknowledge our relative, the sun. So if you could reach up and just whatever your language term is for the sun, in the Lakota language, it's Ampewi. So let's acknowledge our relative, the sun, warms us, brings us much blessings. I would just like to acknowledge that and just bring your arms down. And then later in the session, we'll be sitting for a while, so we'll acknowledge another relative in the universe. So that is the opening. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Next slide, please. So our objectives today are understanding what evaluation is. How does it apply to tribal youth programming? Learning the basic elements of evaluation planning and applying those basic elements by walking through an example of a process for a youth program. So evaluation might seem like a very dry, very, I don't know, whenever I first got into evaluation, I was thinking, oh no. But after I really learned about it, it's so exciting because it gives us so much information, gives us a lot of feedback on how to improve our programs and how to assess what we're doing. Are we reaching our goals? So I would just like to really promote evaluation from that perspective. So next slide.
Thanks, Ethleen. So like Ethleen was just saying, evaluation is just a process that helps us use our data and information to learn more about our programs, about the design of the program, about the activities that we're doing, and about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So we could look at it from the perspective of, is our program operating the way that we intended it to operate? Are we doing the things that we meant to do? How can we keep getting better at what we're doing? Because there's always room for improvement, no matter how well you're doing. And are we creating the change in our youth and our communities and our families that we want to see in a good way? And this is not a judgment about something being good or bad. It's not a personnel evaluation. It's not an audit. This is a cycle of learning and learning to help you make better decisions and to celebrate your successes as well. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little more about what evaluation can help us do. Excuse me. So it can help us really understand what's going well with our program, what can be improved, how are things going in general. And that helps us make decisions about our practice, whether we want to change any of our activities or tweak anything that we're doing to get a better outcome. And it helps us allocate our resources responsibly. Because in terms of the energy that we have as people and in terms of the budgets that we have, nobody has unlimited energy or budgets. You want to make sure that it's going toward things that are actually working well. And maybe if something's not working so well, that's not where you want to devote your resources. Evaluation also helps us tell the stories of our programs and the good work that we're doing and the community and the families and these youth who are doing amazing things. And you want to be able to tell this to a lot of different people. And we'll talk about that more later. And it also helps us understand the perspectives of our relatives. And this is everyone who is involved in these programs, the youth themselves, of course, and their families, your program staff, community partners, funders. Everyone has a perspective that's very important, and evaluation helps us bring all those perspectives together. And of course, it also helps empower and honor the sovereignty of your tribal nation, because nobody else should tell your story but you. Ideally, you want to be able to tell your own story and be able to show your own perspective on what's going on in your community and your program. And finally, it helps sustain successful programs by keeping practice on track. If you're doing well, you want to make sure that you are continuing to do well over the years. It also helps justify continued funding and to get more funding, because if you can show that you're doing well, people will want to support that. Next slide, please. So there are many types of evaluation. You'll hear a lot of different words used to describe evaluation, but for the sake of what we're talking about today, we're going to talk about two types, kind of two buckets of evaluation types. So the first is process or implementation evaluation, and we're going to include monitoring in that. And that looks at the implementation. It looks at how does the program operate? What's the unique context of your community and your agency that it's operating in? And again, is it being operated as planned? Have you had to make some changes to your original design? And why did you do that? And how is that working? And how can we improve the implementation? Do changes need to be made at some point, or is it going well? And then finally, monitoring and continuous quality improvement lets you just keep an eye on things as you're going long term. Are things still going well? Is anything getting off track? Nope, still going good. Okay. So the second type is outcome evaluation, and that's looking at, did the program reach its objectives, and what can we say about the short, medium, and long-term outcomes for our youth? Are we seeing the changes that we want to see? And this can be any type of outcome. It could be cultural identity and belonging. It could be educational outcomes. It could be kids not getting involved in the justice system, getting good jobs, doing better with their families, any kind of outcome that you want to see with your youth. Okay, next slide, please.
Thank you, Marty. So we have also Indigenous evaluation, and we know, all of you know, this is just a reminder that we have Indigenous ways of knowing. We have Indigenous frameworks, we have cultural paradigms, and I think this is really critical to the evaluation process on how we look at it. Marnie said earlier that the evaluation is not to judge, and I think that's something that is really important. It's not to judge something as good or bad. And one of the ways that we have as Indigenous people is to always look at everything before we decide, and that's what evaluation is about, to really examine. In the Lakota language, we have a word for assessing or evaluating. It's wopasi, so looking into it, examining it, before we make a decision about it. And I think all of you can give examples of what Indigenous evaluation is. For thousands of years, we've been doing things that we know works, right? One of the things that we know works is to always acknowledge our relatives in the universe, whether they're animals, whether they're birds, whether they're the stars or the sun, the moon. Those are all our relatives. And we know that in order to live in balance, that we need to acknowledge and respect the relatives in the universe. So that's an example of Indigenous evaluation. A more specific example is, when do we go out and harvest our medicines, for example? So in July, we are supposed to harvest our sage that we use to burn, to purify. We boil it, we use it for tea, we use it for a lot of our ceremonies. When do we not harvest it? We do not harvest it when it seeds, because it's in the process of regenerating, and it's not appropriate to harvest it whenever it's seeding. So those little bitty balls at the end, whenever they start falling off, then we know that whenever they appear and they start falling off, we know that it's not appropriate. So how did we know that? We evaluated and we learned that there's certain things that we do and don't do, and there's appropriate times to do it. So that's an example of Indigenous evaluation. Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? So, like I said, excuse me, we've always gathered and analyzed data and information to guide our decisions. We looked at the natural world and ancestral teachings. So one of the ancestral teachings that we know about is the Buffalo Nation. The Buffalo are our relatives, according to Lakota worldview, and you all have examples from your own Indigenous tribal ways. But one of the Lakota ways is the Buffalo provide us with teachings. So one of the teachings is protect your young at all costs against any threats. So it's really important to look at the teachings as like say an evaluation method or methodology, where we look at what we already have and apply that to what we're doing. So in our tribal youth programs, for example, protecting the youth, making sure that the risks are minimized, that's an example of applying a teaching from the Buffalo Nation. So Western science often reaches the same conclusions that Indigenous science already knew or knows. So I'll give you an example. There is studies on water, that water is, has a life and is alive, but we've always known that. Lakota people and many, and I would say all Indigenous people revered water as sacred, that water is life. And, there's research being done that shows that if you really talk negative around water, that there is an actual chemical change. And that whenever you freeze that water and you examine it under a microscope, for example, then it's murky. There's no patterns. Whenever you talk really positive around water and you say good things, play soothing music, and you freeze that water and you look at the ice under the ice crystals under the microscope, you'll see some beautiful patterns. So we've always known that. Now, what percentage of water is our body? We have, 70 to 80% of our own human body is water. So think about the teachings that we've had about children, that we are not to raise our voice to them. We are not to strike them or hit them. Because of what? Because they are, first of all, sacred beings. Secondly, they're 70 to 80% water, and we can affect their self-esteem, their productivity, their confidence, so just think about that, like how we can apply our teachings to evaluation from Indigenous ways of knowing. So we also need to think about the data sovereignty. Data sovereignty equals tribal sovereignty. So any kind of data that we collect, where are we collecting it from, and how are we honoring that data, that information, where it came from? That's a practice of tribal sovereignty, protecting that knowledge, protecting that data. So how do we use cultural values also to assess, to measure, evaluate? So one of the studies that I looked at as far as using cultural values is there was interviews with elders in one study, and the people that interviewed the elders were asked to, they were Indigenous people. They were from the tribe that the elders were being interviewed. Whenever they were asked, the interviewers, to extract the themes, as they say, from those interviews, then they said they had a really difficult time. And in fact, they ultimately refused to do it because they said those stories exist as a whole, and by taking out pieces and using it, then that was not honoring the source of the information. So think about those cultural values as we apply evaluation methods and as we integrate Indigenous ways of knowing. Next slide, please. So where do we start? We always start from the beginning. You know, how do we start? What is appropriate for your culture, your Indigenous people? So I have to use Lakota examples because I'm Lakota. That's how I grew up, and that's where my teachings come from. So I know all of you have, different ways of knowing as far as your Indigenous roots. So I honor that, but I'm just using this as an example. So we always make offerings. If we're going to start anything, any kind of initiative, then we know we're just humans. So make those offerings, put out tobacco, put out food. That's our Lakota worldview, ways of knowing. That's where we need to start, because we acknowledge that we need help from the outer world, from the spirit world. So that's where we start. Understanding the process of evaluation, how to be culturally sensitive to the youth and the family in the evaluation process. We have to really examine our questions to be make sure they're not invasive, that we're honoring confidentiality and privacy. And then we tell the story, the analysis of the data. What are we collecting? What is it telling us? That's our story. And then finally, giving thanks to the youth, the family, the community, the spiritual forces that be, because we were able to collect this information and we were able to analyze it and then tell a story from it. Next slide, please. So if you look at this graphic here, it's start with the purple. The preparation and readiness. How do we prepare? How do we ready ourselves for evaluation? First of all, we need to have respect for the culture, for tribal sovereignty, and these things are integrated throughout the process. And then go to the green. We formulate a logic model. We make sure that all of these components are interconnected, that each strengthens or contributes to the other components, that we don't take them apart, that they're all part of the story. Then go down to the gold circle. We look at outcomes and performance measures. And then we look at, in the blue circle, we look at the data collection, how we're going to do that, what data are we going to collect. And all of those put together, then we tell our story. And what does that lead to? Sustainability. So we also have to look at, the evaluation resources. Many of our programs don't have funds for an evaluator, but how can we, as tribal youth program staff, school staff, how can we increase our capacity to create an evaluation process that will tell us, what we're doing, keep us on track, and give us feedback to improve whatever we're doing. Next slide, please.
Right, so let's start with the purple circle, preparation and readiness. And what are some of the considerations that we need to think about as we're getting started preparing for evaluation? So first, when do we begin? And I'll say it's never too late to start planning for evaluation, but it's also never too early. Ideally, when you're planning your program, you want to be thinking about the evaluation at the same time. So you're planning those activities and then think, how are we going to know whether this is working or not? You also want to consider your readiness for evaluation. And we're going to talk about a lot of those factors as we go forward with this presentation. And I think we have a nice checklist that will be provided as a handout as well. And remember, the evaluation is an ongoing cycle, and it involves a lot of teamwork between the youth and the adults around them, which are you and your staff and the program providers, your funders, the people who are providing the funding, all the participants, and then if you have technical experts in evaluation to give some advice as well. So it's really a very team-oriented process, and we'll talk more about that as well. Of course, as Ethleen just mentioned, you have to consider what resources you have available in terms of funding, in terms of staff, just the energy and bandwidth that you have to devote to it, and the structure of your program. Next slide, please. So one of the key questions is who's going to actually be driving the car here with your evaluation? And there are a couple of options. One is that you can hire an external evaluator, or you can do it internally and your staff can conduct the evaluation. So there's some pros and cons to each of these methods. So for an external evaluator, who might this be? It could be a private consultant. It could be someone from another department at your tribe or another program who has evaluation experience. It could be somebody from your tribal college or from a local university, or anyone else that you might encounter who has some evaluation expertise. So the pros of this are you have some expertise in evaluation methods, and it's also someone else to do the work, to handle some of this heavy lifting. And also somebody coming in with a little bit of objectivity, which can be helpful. Cons are that could potentially be expensive and you might not have the funding to pay somebody for that. The person that you get may not be from your community and may not have that perspective and understanding of your culture, and you may have to teach them a lot. So if you're doing it internally, that could be anyone on your staff. Again, it's a team effort, but you'll want to have somebody who can be the evaluation champion, and that's somebody who really, the big qualification I would say is somebody who is really positive and energetic around data and research, or at least just not afraid of it, not afraid of Excel. All these things can be learned. It just takes a little bit of a mind to it. And so the pros on having somebody do this internally are that it can be less expensive, not free because you're still paying for somebody's time and it's taking them away from maybe other things that they need to be doing. But it's somebody who is within your community and is familiar with your values and the culture of your program, and who's there to see the day-to-day activities and really understand them in a deep way. The cons can be the learning curve for learning evaluation methods, and then, as I mentioned, time taken away from other responsibilities. Next slide, please. So a big part of evaluation readiness is really creating a culture of evaluation. Like we've both said a couple of times now, it's not, you want it to be a positive thing and have everybody come together and understand why you're evaluating and what it's going to do for the program. So you want to establish that as a real integral part of the program from beginning to end. It's important as part of creating this culture that your evaluation plans really support the values and the goals of your program and your community. And as Ethleen said so beautifully, it needs to be in the context of your cultural values. And it really can't be something that is imposed from the outside. It needs to be a part of what you're doing. And if it conflicts with your culture, your values, it's not going to work. And it's not the data that you collect or that you analyze is ultimately not going to have a lot of value because it's not coming from your community in a good way. So part of it also is just integrating evaluation activities in your day-to-day processes. So as you're thinking about where you can collect data, the best way to do it really is through your normal program activities. And it could be events, it could be meetings, it can be activities with youth. There are a lot of ways to collect data we'll talk about in a little bit. And then you also want to make sure that you're reviewing the data regularly to help guide your discussions and your decision making. This isn't something that you just kind of pull out at the very end of the program to say, okay, how did we do? It's something you want to look at along the way and have it be part of your day-to-day discussions. And then also just create a shared understanding of the value of the evaluation. Everybody, all the stakeholders, everybody should understand why you're doing this, what this is going to give to your program. Next slide. Okay, so We want to create an evaluation team. We want to create that culture and that enthusiasm for evaluation. And we do that by bringing everyone to the circle. So you want to establish an evaluation working group. You want to keep it kind of small, but make sure that the most important people are represented there. And that, of course, is going to vary from program to program, and you'll know who those people are. So you want to have at least a lead person who will coordinate everything. And then you want to have the key people who are involved from the program side. And not everybody, of course, can be on the working group or nothing would ever get done. You'd never be able to schedule a meeting. But you still want to engage a lot of your stakeholders and get their perspectives and be able to consider their interests and their feedback. And these can be folks from your local programs, from the schools, from the courts, from the community. And you'll just want to have a plan for who needs to be on that list, who needs to give their input. And then how are you going to engage them? Are you going to have a regular meeting with certain folks? Are you going to bring together an advisory council? How often will you meet? And then what is the goal? What do you want to accomplish through that interaction? Okay, next slide, please. So another part of getting ready for evaluation is looking at your goals and objectives and making sure that they are SMART. SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, or also relevant, and then time-bound, having a time frame. And this really helps with evaluation, as we're going to see when we start talking about logic models. All of your goals need to be as specific as possible. It's really easy, I think, to have kind of more vague goals or a vision statement, but you want something that is achievable, that you can measure, that you know whether or not you achieved it. You want something that will push you, but that you know is realistic to accomplish, and also something that has a time frame around it so that you can hold yourselves accountable, you can motivate yourselves, and have a plan for your data collection and analysis. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Marnie. So in terms of logic models, understanding our program, having a tool to visualize, to depict, this is where we're at now, and this is where we're going. This is how we're going to get there. What are our goals? What will the changes look like whenever we succeed or whenever we reach a goal? How will we know that it happened, and what are we doing to create these changes? So logic models are very useful to visualize our program's goals and objectives and reflects the actual goals and objectives. Next slide, please. So this is an example of elements of a logic model. So the inputs are what is needed to accomplish the program's activities. So this could mean financial resources, equipment, staff, agency, what are we putting into it? And the activities, what are we doing to reach those, with those inputs to reach the goals? And what are the direct results of the program activities, such as, for example, number of meetings held? What are the outcomes? What are the short and long-term changes that will result from program activities? So we might want to measure, say, well, we're going to increase youth's capacity to participate, or increase access for youth to participate in cultural lifeways events, cultural ceremonies, or we want to increase their knowledge in this, or the behavior. We would like to increase their coping skills. There's a lot of examples. So the elements of a logic model are the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a logic model from an Indigenous worldview. So look at the top, the figure or the graphic there. That's kind of like a light purple: inputs, values, and the context. What context? That's something that we add, what is the culture, what are we, so I'll give you an example. So like, say we want to evaluate a program, and we schedule it for the summer. And in the Lakota country, there's a lot of ceremonies that happen during the summer. So we wouldn't get much participation because we don't want to, we wouldn't want to ask people to be available to us because of their participation in a ceremony. We don't want to disrupt that. So that's kind of like the context, the schedule, the culture. Now go to the right, the light blue figure there, outputs, the short-term outcomes, what are we putting in? Marnie will talk about an actual example. I'm just giving an overview here. The green figure at the bottom, the triangle, activities and contributors to change. What are those? So these three, where have we been? Where are we going? And how will we get there? And the rust-colored triangle there, we look at the long-term outcomes when we get there. For example, how are we going to get there? And when we get there, how will we know? That's our story. That's our journey. Our story might mean 2 years. Our story might mean 5 years. Our story might mean, far off into the future. But the point is that we have a process to really document and map that. Next slide, please. So I want to mention Dr. Marilyn Zimmerman. She developed a wonderful logic model on increasing cultural pride and identity, and she actually did a session on logic models. I believe it was last year, and we do have that recording, on our website. So if you'd like to access that. So we took some of her work here and we looked at, use this as an example. So this is a logic model to increase cultural pride and identity. So where is our story? What is our story? We want to have well-being, so think about that. This logic model starts with a positive, as far as well-being, increasing well-being. A lot of logic models will start with a problem or a need, what are the changes that we want to see? And what are the cultural values and principles that will guide our work? Healing is our future. That's the whole overall, motivation for all of this. What are the issues that impact making the change? We have a story of resilience. What are the activities and resources and inputs we will employ to meet each goal? What do we do? What can we do today? How can we support our relatives? What will the outputs be? There's healing in our culture, acknowledging that and specifying, specific healing activities. What will you do to measure the outcomes, honoring our youth today? How are we going to know that we got there, whatever the goal is? And what is our hope for the future? Honoring our youth. So for example, if we were to look at, the child abuse rates that we have in this country, if we were to restore children to their role as sacred beings, then the rate of child abuse would go down, because we would be at a place where we would say, these are sacred beings, so we do not, abuse them in any way. We don't hit them, we don't raise our voice to them. So just think about that, restoring our youth to their rightful role, and children also, and families. So it just depends on what the goal is. So next slide, please. This is an example of another logic model. So what we're trying to portray here is that we don't have to have the linear logic model, where we start here on the left and then we go to the right. We can look at it as climbing a mountain, like the American Indian Higher Education Consortium did. So they started at the bottom. What are the activities that are going to get that our youth or our students will use to get to the top of this mountain? They'll graduate and seek higher education, after high school or after college. So they have their activities at the bottom, climb up their short-term outcomes, and then go further up, their long-term outcomes, and then they have their activities in there. So it just depends on how you want to portray your logic model. It doesn't have to be a certain way. There's many ways, but we're showing you just a few examples. Next slide, please.
And here's one more example. This is something that we use at the Capacity Building Center for Tribes, and we call it the Pathway to Change. And this is a circular logic model because it represents the cycle of learning and action, which never really ends, as I think we all know. And this revolves around your vision for your program and your community. So when you think about what you want things to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what would you want to see for the youth and the families in your community? And then this also has a lot of the same elements. So what do we know about the youth and their strengths and their challenges and what's going on with them right now? Who do we impact? Who's involved? And that's everyone from the youth and the families to your own staff, to the community members, everybody we talked about earlier. What do we bring? What are the resources, both financial and cultural and spiritual and in terms of people that we have to offer? And then what we change, which are our goals and objectives, what we do, the activities, and then how we know, which are the measures and the indicators that we look at to say, how do we know that we're creating the change that we want to see? And then it goes back into what we know and keeps going around. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you have your logic model and you know what you want to see, the next step is building your outcomes and your performance measures and your indicators. And the best way to start with that is to think about what questions do you want to answer about your program. So first, we kind of narrow it down a little bit by choosing evaluation focus areas. What are the areas of your program that are the most important to evaluate? And then we think about our audiences. Who are the key audiences that are going to have questions about the program and the evaluation? And that could be everyone from OJJDP and the performance measures. It can be your tribal council, your families, people in the community. It's going to be different for every program, but you think through like who really is going to want to know about what we're doing. And then think about each of those audiences and what questions are they going to have about the program and what's going on with it. And then finally, how are you going to use that information? Once you have the answers to these questions, who do you want to tell and how do you want to use that to keep building on the successes that you're having? Next slide, please. So all of this eventually is going to go into an evaluation plan. And a way I like to think about it is that it's a living roadmap for your evaluation journey. You're going to keep working on this. It's never going to be set in stone, but it's going to give you, help you set out these elements of the evaluation experience. So you'll have your focus areas once you choose those, then the questions that you're going to ask about each of those areas, and then think about the signs of progress. How are you going to know that you're making progress towards your goals? What do you want to see? What's going to tell you that? And then the potential data sources for those indicators. So how are we going to find out what's going on? And then the timing, which, as Ethleen was talking about, is very important because there are good times to collect data, there are bad times, and that could be a complex issue to think about. Next slide, please. So what kind of information do we need to answer our questions? So there are kind of two buckets of data that we like to talk about, quantitative and qualitative. So the quantitative data is anything that involves numbers or counting. So how many participants that you have, how many of them have participated in each of the activities, things like that. And that can be collected in many ways, through forms and spreadsheets. You can do surveys. You can ask for data from other organizations. And then you have qualitative data. And these are really the voices of our relatives. This is anything that's not a number. So it could be the thoughts and opinions from your participants, from staff and other partners. Many of the Indigenous ways of knowing that Ethleen was talking about earlier, which are unique to your community and your culture. And then you can also collect it through things like surveys, talking circles, focus groups, just normal conversations, and a lot of other sources. And that's something that you just need to consider what is the best way for your program and your community to be able to get that information. Next slide, please. So as you're thinking about it, it's good to put this into a detailed data collection plan because this can get complicated. And it's less complicated if you just write it out. So we're going to talk about what data do we want to collect? And then where is that data? Who has it? Is it in somebody's head? Is it in somebody's database somewhere else? Is this something that we're going to collect through program activities? Where is this going to come from? And then who's going to be responsible for collecting it? Because it's not going to collect itself. Somebody has to take the lead and be able to manage that process. And then what is our target date for data collection? There are a lot of factors that go into that, whether it's what is the most appropriate time to speak with people, or when do you have performance measures due to OJJDP, or when is the next tribal council meeting? There are a lot of different things to consider with that. And then how is the data going to be stored and who has access to it? So will it go into a spreadsheet? Is it going to go into a folder? And then who's going to have access to it? Because data can be very sensitive and it's a trust. People give us their trust when they offer data, and we want to make sure we're respecting that.
Thank you, Marty. So the data is really, really important. And sometimes, like we're trying to collect it, but maybe it already exists. So we might need an MOU or a partnership agreement to support data sharing. So for example, like say we have a, here on my reservation, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, we have a juvenile detention center. We also have some youth programs and we have a shelter. So, if we had a data sharing agreement, then we would be able to collaborate, on, for example, services, for them. So we're not collecting the same data. And those of you that work with youth, that, sometimes youth and families get very fatigued from having to fill out, the same form, be asked the same questions. So that's just an example of how, MOU or partnership agreements would really, really help. So next slide, please. So how do we monitor the signs of progress? We regularly look at our data to help things go in the right direction. So we're looking at service quality, we're looking at performance measures, we'll correct, whatever we need to do, we'll celebrate success along the way. And I think that's something that we often don't do or forget to do. So we might come, like say in the Indigenous worldview, then we kind of plan our calendar according to the seasons. So we're in the spring season now. We just had a ceremony where we go up to the mountain in the Black Hills of South Dakota and where we welcome the thunder beings back. And we know that the thunder beings have, great impact in our life. They bring blessings, they bring, energy, and they also can bring floods. So we ask for their compassion. We thank them, but we also ask for their compassion. So we know that we need to really look at how, what is our progress? What is our plan? How are we monitoring it? What is the reality? And monitoring, I think, and documenting all of these things are really important for sustainability, because people will leave a program, for example, and the documentation is still there, so we can still sustain what we're doing. Next slide, please. So telling our story from present to future using the data. So we have baseline. Where are we starting at? Do we start, like, say, whenever our program first start, or whenever we start a certain activity? It's really up to you where you want to start, but having that baseline, something to compare it to. And what are the interim and the short-term outcomes? And finally, what are the follow-up and the long-term outcomes when the project ends, when the activities end? What information do we have to assess, as far as reaching our goal? Next slide, please. So who do you think needs to hear the story of your program? You can go ahead and chat it in. We're not asking this, just for in terms of, having you respond, but we would like to hear from you in the chat about, if you were to tell your story, who needs to hear it? Like say the tribal council or parents or youth or your community, maybe your board, just think about it, who needs to hear that. Next slide, please. So let's walk through this. Let's walk through this process with an example. So we have a vision statement. We want to, for example, strengthen our youth, our families, and communities. We have a mission statement. So, for example, our mission is to revitalize and reconnect our tribal youth to their culture so that they will have a strong foundational cultural pride and identity. And our goal is to increase, for example, the cultural skills of 30 tribal youth to support their feelings of cultural identity and pride. So this is just an example program. Next slide, please. So how do we prepare for evaluation? First of all, we create a culture of evaluation. The programs that I've directed along, in my work experience is, there was always an evaluation component. And what I've learned along the way and what I really try to promote is that evaluation is about everybody. And it's from the beginning, we start from the beginning. And we always, include everybody because everybody's input is important. So we create this culture of evaluation, again, not to judge or to determine if something's right or wrong or good or bad. It's to create a process to, give feedback, what are we doing, reflect, and how are we doing this? Do we need to change this? So creating that culture of evaluation is really important. Convening evaluation working groups, include the stakeholders, the youth, the elders, the community people. That's really important. Review the goals and objectives and develop a logic model and develop an evaluation action plan and connect with your technical assistance providers. The Tribal Youth Resource Center has some great technical assistance providers. So, and you probably do with some of the projects that you're working with. So that's real important resource. Next slide, please.
Okay, so let's look at an example logic model for our example program. And we're just going to stick with just the straightforward logic model elements just to make this a little bit easier to follow for right now. So looking at the inputs of our program, so this program identified a number of great factors that they have as resources, which includes resiliency, a strong cultural identity and way of life. They have intact tribal values and laws and principles. So they're bringing a lot of strengths to this program. So what are their activities? So the goal is to build the cultural identity of their youth, and they're going to do this through cultural skill building. And there are a few activities that they've identified. One, they would like their youth to participate in coming of age ceremonies. They would like to address trauma through healing ceremonies. They also want to make sure their youth all have a tribal name. And then they also want to offer their youth some education on traditional gender roles. So let's look at the outputs. What outputs are we going to see from these activities? Well, we'll hopefully see the youth receiving their tribal names. We'll see them participating in coming of age ceremonies. We'll see them participating in healing ceremonies. They're actually going to get some education on gender roles. And we'd also like to see that they are understanding and using these ceremonial elements in their own prayer. So long term, what outcomes do we want to see from this? So we want to see that their cultural skills are increasing. We want to see that the youth feel a greater sense of cultural identity and pride within themselves, and that their overall well-being is being enhanced by this increased sense of cultural identity. So all of these things kind of go in a logical flow and build on each other toward these ultimate outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's think what an evaluation plan might look like for this program. So first, of course, we choose our focus areas. So we look at our logic model and we can pick out 3 major focus areas that we want to think about. Cultural skill building, the sense of cultural identity, and then their overall youth well-being. So looking just at the skill building as an example, we have an evaluation question. So to what extent have the youth participated in their cultural teachings and ceremonies? So how are we going to know that that's happening? Well, we can look at the number of these youth who received their tribal name, the number of youth who participated in the coming of age ceremony and in the healing ceremonies. And that could just come from program data. So what's the timing on this? Well, we have a community advisory committee and we have a monthly meeting with them. So it would make sense to review this with them every month. So that means somebody has to gather this data together every month so that we can talk about how it's going. And cultural identity, again, we're looking at to what extent has the program contributed to youth identifying and establishing their cultural identity? And we'll know if we see an improvement in youth's confidence in their cultural identity. And this can be reported by the youth themselves, their families, and the program staff. So how are we going to know this? How are we going to find this out? Well, really by talking to folks. So we can interview the youth, their families, program staff. We could do a cultural identity survey with the youth, or there are many other ways that you might find this out through conversation, through talking circles, through activities, that are just unique to your way of doing things. And for the timing, this is something you really want to look at over time to be able to see the change hopefully happening. So you want to be able to measure this at the time that the youth are entering the program, and then maybe 6 months into the program, at completion of the program, assuming this program lasts maybe a year. And then if you can, do a follow-up after, maybe 6 months after they've left the program to see if these changes are still moving forward. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so how are we going to collect all this data? So here are a few examples of the things that we have been talking about. So let's say we want the number of youth who are participating in a coming of age ceremony. Depending on how often that happens, we want to collect that. That could just be aggregated from the program files and kept in a spreadsheet. For the youth sense of cultural identity, we talked about a few options. For example, a cultural identity survey, interviews with the youth, their family members, or program staff. And so you want to look at target dates for when is a good time to be able to do these surveys. When are youth and families and staff going to be available and willing to do it? And then also you can think about when you need to report this data. So if you need to report this, when's your due date for your OJJDP performance measures? You might want to report this at a community event or a tribal council meeting, and think about that. And then the survey data can be entered into a spreadsheet, and your interview notes can be de-identified for privacy and then stored in a project folder. And again, since this is somewhat your personal information, you want to make sure that that is kept in a secure way. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a way that you could manage your data. So this is really easy. It's just in Excel, a very simple spreadsheet. And you can have all the different data elements that you want to collect laid out. You can color code it if you feel like it. But it's a very simple way just to make sure that you have everything together. And you want at least one person to really be responsible for making sure that this is kept updated. Next slide, please. And here's a quick look at a potential cultural identity survey. Again, this is very generic because this is just an example program. So you would probably have very different questions depending on your own community and culture. But here's a way that you could set up a survey that would be very quick for a youth to take. It has a simple scale here, a Likert scale, indicating whether the youth would strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree, or whether they feel it's not applicable to them. And then you could ask questions like, getting my tribal name made me feel more like I was a part of my tribe. My coming of age ceremony made me feel more like I was a part of my tribe, and whether they agree or disagree with that. And whether they want to learn more about the history of their people, they want to learn their language better, whether they want to participate in more activities. And then you could also have elements here where they can speak in their own voice, and you could ask questions like, what other cultural activities would you like to participate in? Or it could just be something as simple as, tell me more about your experience. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then finally, how do we tell this story? How do we start with this? Well, first we have to be able to read it ourselves. And one of the things we like to do with that is just by putting the data into a visual form, because that makes it really easy to be able to kind of see what's going on. So here are a couple just basic examples looking at the youth cultural experiences at program entry versus program completion. So over time, and this is just straight outputs. So have they had these cultural experiences or not? So we can see that when they came into the program, 2 out of our 30 youth already had their cultural names. But by the end of the program, all 30 had them. So that's a really big increase. And the same with the coming of age ceremony. 1 youth had already had that coming in, but then all 30 had it at the end. So that really shows what your program accomplished with this. And then looking at outcomes, so we did that survey. So what were the results of that? What did the youth report? So we could say, what did they experience in their cultural identity, and break it out by activity. So we can see that having a cultural name for all 30 of the youth, they really felt like that increased their cultural identity. And almost as many felt that the coming of age ceremony and the healing ceremony really helped increase that sense of cultural identity. And quite a few also thought that the gender role education helped, but not quite as many. So you can see those differences really laid out. And that's a very easy way to be able to share this story, which we'll talk about with the next slide.
Thank you, Marnie. So sharing our story is real important. How do we continue the conversation, the dialogue? We can develop reports. We can develop wonderful infographics. I've seen some beautiful infographics about, people's evaluation stories. We can use them in presentations, handouts. We can create brochures from them. And sharing the learnings, how do we share what we've learned? One of the things that I learned in my experience is I directed in an adolescent substance abuse residential center for 13 years on my reservation. And one of the things I learned was that the things that we were providing as far as like say the counseling, the support to youth, the education, the family counseling, family groups, all wonderful services. And through our guidance, through our spiritual guidance, we learned that we weren't paying attention to the medicine for the spirit. So those individuals that had very deep spirit wounds, like maybe from abuse or traumatic experiences or exposures in their lifetime, we didn't have an opportunity, or we weren't creating an opportunity for them to really release that and to share it. And so we were given some direction on how to do that. Have them write it down. They don't have to share it with anybody, because there's often a lot of shame and blame, and that people don't want to share things. So the guidance that we were given was to have them write it down and then have them burn it at our one of our sacred fires at the Inipi ceremony, the Purification Lodge ceremony. So we started sharing that with other people, with other programs, is that there is, there's a mental, emotional capacity building, but there's also a spirit building, in terms of Indigenous people. So, and then who needs to hear this story? Again, some of you in the chat said, the tribal council, the parents, the elders, we agree with all of that, the schools, families, And then also, we really need to extend appreciation for the time and the knowledge that people give us to collect data, to analyze, to share this story. You know, if someone gives you data, always give it back to them. You know, that's theirs, that what they gave you. And then the sustainability planning is really important also. So next slide, please. So again, we go back to this graphic, you know, preparation and readiness is important, you know, not just jumping into it, but preparing for it, creating that culture of evaluation, you know, having, formulating a logic model. I think that's really a lot of fun because people can get together and map it out. You know, this is where we're at. This is, you know, these are the activities we're going to do, and this is how we're going to get there. And this is what we hope to see, you know, and out of that, you know, outlining the performance measures, creating a process for data collection, analyzing it, and then telling our story. You know, this is our story. This is what we did. Next slide, please. So again, you know, the suggested next steps are to create that culture of evaluation, convene an evaluation working group. And Marnie mentioned earlier, you know, who can do this and who should do this. You know, we know that, you know, there might be limited number of people out there that are quote unquote evaluators, but we shared a process with you where, you know, the program staff can be evaluators, and we can have this process to, you know, collect data, to analyze it, and to tell the story. So that evaluation working group is really important, including the stakeholders, reviewing the goals and objectives, developing a logic model, developing the action plan. How are we going to do this? Connect with technical assistance providers and or other resources. There's online training out there, you know, on how to do evaluation. We have a lot of Indigenous, you know, resource people that can help with training and technical assistance. So I just really encourage that. Next slide, please. If you could go back to the discussion and the questions. So we had a question in the in the chat, and Toshka, Leon, you might have seen some other questions that I missed, but one of the ones I seen was about, you know, data sources, databases for youth, and what I know about, and this is just preliminary, there's a lot of resources out there. CDC.gov has an American Indian Alaska Native Health data, so you can extract from that. AmericanProgress.org has health disparities by race, and American Indian and Alaska Natives are included in that. Youth.gov has data on American Indian and Alaska Native youth, and of course IHS.gov, Indian Health Service.gov also is a great source of data. Do you have any other references or resources, Marnie, in that area?
Youth.gov was the one I was thinking of as well. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think the Center for Native American Youth, CNAY.org, also has some data.
Oh, okay, CNAY, that's Center for Native American Youth.
Mm-hmm.
And I also would like to acknowledge too that we do have the sample Excel sheets, the data collection tool, evaluation action plan. Those are all available also for you to use, and they will be sent out as part of the, you know, the resources from this session. Any other questions, Toshka, Leon, that you see?
No questions, Kumi. I just know there was a comment talking about it's important to have feedback from tribal council too, and also the community. So just to reiterate that.
Well, good. Anything else you want to share, Marnie?
Not that I can think of. Just my thanks for everyone who came and listened to us talk about evaluation. I hope it was useful and
Yes.
that you'll all have wonderful evaluations in your programs.
I hope so too. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Thank you for attending D1, telling our story through evaluation. As a reminder, there's a link for the workshop session evaluation in the chat box. Please click on this link now and take a moment to complete the survey. There's also a sign that links to the session evaluations in the main virtual lobby. Additionally, at the conclusion of your participation in the 2021 OJJDP Tribal Youth Virtual National Conference, we ask that you take a moment to complete the overall evaluation. There is a sign located in the virtual lobby to access it. Please click on the overall evaluation sign to open the survey and complete it before you leave the conference for the last time. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. If you have been unable to join a session that are interested in, a recording will be posted on this platform and will remain up until April 30th. After this time, you may find the recordings of all conference sessions at tribalyouth.org.